Omagyanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshuranitam Dena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manubhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swam Karantikam Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nivishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadeshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadad Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Rama. Un Kurti Vachalam Pangolange Yakripa Taraham Bande Shri Gurum Dinatarinam Durgame Patiminantasya Sakalat Parigatir Muhu Swakripa Yasti Danena Santa Santavanam. Today we're continuing our study of the Upadesh, Upakhyane Upadesh, the instructive stories of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Who remembers the story from last time? You want to repeat it, Kantu Karnava?
Happily, bro. It is a story of a teacher, of a mother who has hired a tutor for teaching mathematics to her son, and geometry teacher. So the teacher is teaching A, B, C in the beginning when the child is in first standard. As he grows up and goes to the higher standards, 6 or 7, he is taught trigonometry, geometry, and he is still teaching A, B, C, which are taught to draw a diagram. So the mother overhears this, and she becomes really upset with the teacher. She says that you were teaching ABC in first standard, and now he's in seventh standard. Still, you are teaching ABC. So she fires the teacher, and similarly, so there's an analogy that there could be in Bhakti Yoga, the practice is chanting Hare Krishna. A beginner is chanting Hare Krishna. A devotee who is practicing for some time, he is chanting Hare Krishna. And the devotees who are advanced, they are also chanting Hare Krishna. But the depth is not the same. So we should not misunderstand that both of them are at the same platform. We are growing in our bhakti, but the process remains the same.
It was also referring to what class of people?
Sorry, Guru?
It was also referring to a particular so-called group of transcendentalists.
I'm not sure, Guru.
It's referring to Mayavadis who think that they can accept bhakti for the purpose of having a means to an end, without understanding that actually the means is the end. So they're like the mother, which just accepts ABCs at the lower standard, but then doesn't know how to apply ABCs at a higher standard.
Okay.
So there's some Mayavadis who worship the deity, they chant Hare Krishna, but they don't know how to apply. They don't understand how those principles are functioning in the realm of transcendence just as much as the time of sadhana. Clear?
Yeah, yeah. So if I understand it right, Mayavadis think that deity worship and the chanting process is a means, but the end goal is different, to merge into the supreme. And
Correct.
so, yeah, they reject the ABC later, which is the process of deity worship and chanting Hare Krishna or accepting a spiritual master. This is a means. Okay, okay, bro. But ideally, that is the means and that's the end also.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Thank you,
And
bro.
was anyone able to use this example in any of their classes? That's okay. It's just extra credit.
Mm. Hope we'll be more careful next time.
No, no, no. It's okay. You don't have to. I was just curious if anyone used it.
Mm. Vishal, please.
Okay, so today we're reciting another story, which was told by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, which Srila Prabhupada told a variation of. And it's about a frog who, there's a baby frog, and the baby frog goes out of the well one day and sees an elephant. And the baby frog returns to the well and tells its mother, "Mother, I've seen an elephant today." And the mother says, "Oh, really? Was it this big?" And it puffed up a little bit. And then the baby frog said, "No, no, no, not that big." And then the mother frog said, "Is it this big?" And it puffed up a little bit more. And the baby frog said, "No, no, no, not that big." And then it puffed up a little bit more. And then it was starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then eventually it exploded. So, in the same way, there's a nice verse in the Chaitanya Charitamrita which describes this consciousness, which I'll pull up right now. Jiva Ishvara Tattva Kabo Nahi Sam Vala Agni Rasyache Spulingirakon. A living entity and the absolute personality of Godhead are never to be considered equal, just as a fragmental spark can never be considered the original flame. Mayavadi sannyasis consider themselves Brahman, and they superficially speak of themselves as Narayana. The monistic disciples of the Mayavad school, known as Smarta Brahmanas, are generally household Brahmanas who accept the Mayavadi sannyasis as a Narayana incarnate. Therefore, they offer their obeisances to them. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu immediately protested this unauthorized system, specifically mentioned that a sannyasi is nothing but a fragmental portion of the Supreme. In other words, he is nothing more than an ordinary living being. He is never Narayana, just as a molecular portion of sunshine is never the sun itself. The living entity is nothing but a fragmental part of the absolute truth. Therefore, at no stage of perfection can a living entity become the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This Mayavad viewpoint is always condemned by the Vaishnava school. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself protested this philosophy. When the Mayavadis accept sannyas and consider themselves Narayana, they become so puffed up that they do not even enter the temple of Narayana to offer obeisances, for they falsely think themselves Narayana himself. Although Mayavadi sannyasis may offer respect to other sannyasis and address them as Narayana, they do not go to the Narayana temple and offer respects. These Mayavadi sannyasis are always condemned and are described as demons. The Vedas clearly state that the living entities are subordinate parts and parcels of the Supreme, Eko Bahunam Yovididati Kalman. The Supreme Being Krishna maintains all living entities. Halindiya Samvit Alishta Satchidananda Ishvaraha Svavidya Samvrito Jiva Saklesha Nikarakara. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Supreme Controller, is always full of transcendental bliss and is accompanied by the potencies known as Ladini and Sambit. Conditioned soul, however, is always covered by ignorance and embarrassed by the threefold miseries. Thus, he is a treasure house of all kinds of tribulations. Ye mudakahe jiva ishvara hoya sam seta pashanti hoya dande tarayam. A foolish person who says that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the same as the living entity is an atheist, and he becomes subjected to punishment by the superintendent of death, Yamaraj. Purport: Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says that the word Pashanti refers to one who considers the living entity under the control of the illusory energy to be equal to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is transcendental to all material qualities. Another kind of Pashanti is one who does not believe in the spirit soul, the superior potency of the Lord, and therefore does not distinguish between spirit and matter. While describing one of the offenses against the chanting the holy names, specifically the offense called Shruti Shastra Nindanam, Jiva Goswami states in his Bhakti Sandarbha, Yatha Pasyanta Margena, Dattacaya Sabadeva Pasaktakam, Prasant Worshippers of impersonalists like Dattatreya are also Pashantis. Considering the offense of Aham Mama Bhuti, or Dehatma Bhuti, considering the body to be the self, Jiva Goswami states, Deva Drivinyari Ni Nimittikataka, Pasyanta Sabena Cha, Vasoparada Eva Lakshate, Pashyanta Na Mayatva Kesam. Those who are overly absorbed in the conception of the body and the bodily necessities are also called Pashantis. Elsewhere in the Bhakti Sandarbha, it is stated, Ujisha Devata Eva, Junoti Cha Dadati Cha, Sapastintiti Vigneya, Swatataro Vapi Karnamasu. Pashanti is one who considers the demigods and the Supreme Personality of Godhead to be one. Therefore, Pashanti worshippers of any kind of demigod of the Supreme Person. Therefore, Pashanti worships any kind of demigod as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. One who disobeys the orders of the spiritual master is also considered a Pashanti. The word Pashanti has been described in many places in Srimad Bhagavatam, including 4, 2, 28, 30, and 32, 5, 6, 9, 12, 2, 13, and 3, and 12, 3, 43. On the whole, a Pashanti is a non-devotee who does not accept the Vedic conclusions. In the Hari Bhakti Vilas, there is a verse quoted from the Padma Purana describing the Pashanti. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu quotes this verse as the following text. What this story which Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati is giving is that a Mayavadi philosopher, or as Srila Prabhupada is saying in his commentary here, Pashanti, or Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is saying, a Pashanti is one who considers that the living entity and Krishna are one in all respects. And so due to their puffed up nature, they neglect going to the temples of Narayana, they neglect the association of pure-hearted devotees due to enviousness of those devotees, thinking themselves liberated, free from the modes of material nature. They create a mockery of spiritual life due to their false conclusions, and they delude themselves and other followers due to not having a clear sadhana and sadhya. Natebedu swartha katim hi Vishnu. We all have something which we need to be moving forward towards, and unless one is moving towards Krishna, then one is moving in the wrong direction. And if one considers that the ultimate goal of life is to realize oneself as Narayana, then what they do is they put themselves in a catastrophic condition where they will eventually be brought down to a lower mode of a very low realm of material suffering. Yene Rivindaksha Vimuktimanina Swayasha Bhava Abashuddha Budaya. Arura Krinshena Param Padam Tata Pashyantato Nadraka Yusma Hungry. That even if someone comes to the position of considering themselves liberated and one with Narayana, due to that false philosophical conception, they have to come back down again. And this is because they are putting themselves in a position of being overtly offensive to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And simultaneously, they're functioning in an artificial position of life. They have gone to the extreme end of materialism by considering themselves to be God. As Srila Prabhupada explains this Mayavad philosophy is the last snare of Maya. Does anyone know what a snare means? You don't have to raise your hand, Prabhu. We don't have that many people.
Snare means a trap.
The trap. Yeah, so if it's the last snare of Maya, then we can only imagine how pervasive this consciousness is within the conditioned soul. It's not a small thing. Srila Prabhupada, when he was living in New York and he was preaching to these new American devotees coming and hearing from him, they were always wondering, why is Srila Prabhupada always speaking about these Mayavadis? And, he was going on. And then one day, Satsvarup Maharaj realized that we were the Mayavadis. So what is this Mayavad conception? Deyatma buddhi kuna petri dhatuke. To consider this body to be oneself. Deyatma buddhi kuna petri dhatuke. That this body is oneself, and this body is the ultimate attainment. And the final progression of this bodily conception of life is to consider oneself to be God. Because under the spell of the material energy, the nature of the conditioned soul is to try to exploit and enjoy this material world. Apareyam idastvanyam prakritim vidi meparam. Jiva bhuta mahabhavo yadidam darate jagat. Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita that the living entity ensnared within the material energy is subjected to the disposition of trying to exploit that material energy. And under such a conception, mama ishvam so jiva loke, jiva bhuta sanasanaha, manashastrani indriyani prakriti stani karsati, that they struggle very hard with the mind and the senses which try to exploit that material energy. Because although they're trying to use a material body which is very limited in its capacity, they think that that body can bring them some pleasure. Ashadapi kleshas to ashadeha. But actually, this material body is the abode of suffering. So in order to try to transcend that bodily conception of life, people take up various spiritual practices, people adopt so many philosophies, but because they're not willing to hear the authentic conclusions which are given in the Shastra, they impose their material consciousness onto the topic of transcendence. And thus they minimize the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and they negate the natural position of the living entity's original consciousness of being an insignificant, infinitesimal part and parcel of the absolute truth. And because they sidestep that conception by hearing from various different sources, which is just concocted according to the limited material senses, then what takes place is they hear conclusions if they even come in contact with knowledge which is being presented on the authority of the Vedas, or seemingly being presented on the authority of the Vedas. They don't seek out authentic descriptions of the Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam. Rather, they look for gonavrittis. They look for conclusions which are given according to the concoctions of someone's mind. So Mayavadi commentaries on the Vedanta Sutra, Mayavadi's commentaries on the Srimad Bhagavatam, Mayavadi's commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, is they concoct meanings from the words of Sanskrit without consulting the Nirukti or the Amara Kosha dictionaries in order to come to an authentic conclusion. And they also bypass the commentaries of Vaishnavacharyas, and they take shelter of Sripad Shankaracharya's commentaries, and thus they perpetuate this misconception of life. And this is all due to an inherent enviousness of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It all comes from an inherent desire to ultimately want to be God. So Mayavadi is the pinnacle. Mayavad philosophy is the pinnacle of material consciousness, materialistic consciousness. Everyone is existing in the material world because of this Mayavad philosophy, thinking themselves to be God, thinking themselves to be enjoyers, thinking themselves to be the ultimate controllers. But when that philosophy becomes a conscious disposition, rather than an underlying unconscious disease, then it becomes extremely offensive to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And one guarantees their imprisonment in the material world. So the human form of life is not meant for speculating or coming up with faulty conclusions according to the Vedas. These false doctrines which Mayavadis put, that the living entity is identical with the Supreme in all respects, it completely bypasses the conclusions of the Upanishads and all the Vedic literatures. Nityo nityanam chaitanas chaitananam eko bahunam yo vididati kaman. That there is one supreme living entity whose body is composed of eternity, knowledge, and bliss. And that living entity is, or that entity is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And the Supreme Personality of Godhead is always functioning in that transcendental position, as Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, that his birth and his appearance in this world is completely transcendental. Janma karma chame divyam evyam yoveti tattvataha. And those who try to minimize that position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Naham prakashasta sarvasya yoga maya samanvrita mudo yam nabijananti mudo yam nabijananti mayam evam si Naham prakashasta sarvasya yoga maya samanvrita. Lokamam ajam advayam. That he doesn't manifest himself to such persons. He keeps himself covered through the agency of his yoga maya. And that yoga maya manifests itself in the form of Mayavad philosophy. But we can see throughout the Upanishads and the Vedas clear indications of Krishna's personality. Hiranyamayena paprena satyasyapi hitam mukam tattvam pusam apavrinu satyam dharmaya dristate. That the devotee in the Sri Sri Upanishad is praying that now please remove the covering of your impersonal effulgence and reveal your beautiful face to me. So there's a clear distinction between the knower and the known. What is to be known is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the knower is the living entity himself. But the living entity, under the spell of the material energy, accepts this material body to be oneself and tries to create concocted philosophies on the basis of their limited sense perception. So what is the remedy for this disposition towards Mayavad, this disposition to try to take the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead? This is explained by Lord Brahma in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Jnane priyasyam udapasyam namanta eva jivanti sammukaritam upadiyavartam stane stita shrutigatam tanuvan manobir ye prayasho jitatisho pisachai lokyam. That the Supreme Personality of Godhead cannot be understood by jnana prayas, to create false conclusions that because my body is temporary and because my body is subjected to birth, death, old age, and disease, when the absolute truth, Brahman, descends into this world in the form of Krishna, that body is also temporary. So because this body is temporary for myself, Krishna's body is also temporary for himself. But Krishna doesn't say that in the Bhagavad Gita. Nowhere does he say that. Krishna says just the opposite, that his appearance in this world is completely transcendental. And although the living entities have been accepting so many births since time immemorial, Krishna remains in his steady transcendental position. So what does Mayavad mean? Mayavad means to think that the living entity, Krishna, and this material world are all Maya. And this is all due to jnana prayas, all due to this disposition to try to understand this world through our empiric senses, understand this world through our imperfect sense perception. So what is the remedy to overcome this offensive disposition, which may be existing in a full-blown manifestation, which is found in Mayavadi philosophers, or in the inherent material conditioning of any living entity? The remedy is jnane prayasyam udapasyam namanta eva. One has to kick off this disposition to want to understand the absolute truth through their limited material senses, to draw conclusions from their limited material senses, and to think that my senses can come to such a high conclusion of understanding the absolute truth. That is the same as the frog being puffed up in the well. Srila Prabhupada would often tell this story in relationship to this verse, Jnane prayasyam udapasyam namanta eva. So Jnane prayasyam udapasya, you have to give up this frog, Dr. Frog-like mentality, this mother frog-like mentality, to try to equate yourself with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, to try to impose your senses upon the realm of transcendence. But rather, one should become humble and enter into their natural position of seeing themselves as an insignificant living entity. And this is the mood of a devotee approaching the absolute truth. Jnane prayasam udapasyam namanta eva. The devotee, rather than thinking he can understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead through his limited senses and through his limited mind and intelligence, offers his heart, words, mind, and body at the feet of someone who has understood that truth, and at the feet of someone who is practically living that truth according to the mukhya vritti conclusions of the Shastra, which means that person explains the Shastras as they are. Srila Prabhupada wrote the Bhagavad Gita as it is. So the devotee, they present things as they are. They live the Shastras as it is, not as I would like it to be. Mayavadi philosophy means understanding Bhagavad Gita as I like. Vaishnava philosophy means understanding Bhagavad Gita as it is. So Srila Prabhupada, when he was reading the commentary of Dr. Ramakrishna, and Dr. Ramakrishna is saying that to surrender unto me means to surrender to the internal, to the essence which is inside Krishna. Srila Prabhupada said there is no difference between the inside and outside of Krishna because it is absolute. Absolute truth. Satya, param satyam dhimahi. It's the absolute truth, which means there's no such thing as Krishna's internal and external. To surrender to Krishna's internal means to surrender onto him personally, to develop a relationship with him personally. So someone who has cultivated that personal relationship of a servant and master, namanta eva, one should surrender to that person immediately. Jivanti sam mukaritam upadiyavartam. One should hear from that person with submission, in the mood of a disciple, in the mood of a servant, trying to understand the absolute truth in a humble way, not thinking that I have become a great preacher, not thinking that I have become a great thinker, I have become a great teacher, I've become God, but feeling oneself to be very meek and humble. And if one has that mood of namanta eva and hearing from the right source, then sthanesti tashuti gatam tanuvan manobir. One doesn't need to change their position. One can just stay where they are, whether one is a grihasta, whether one is a brahmachari, whether one is a vanaprastha or a sannyasi. You just stay in your position. Grihe tako, vane tako, sara hari boli dako. You just stay in your position and you hear the message of the Srimad Bhagavatam from one who has realized that message of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And the effect of that is rather than you becoming God himself, you attain even a higher position than God, which is Stane stita shruti gatam tanuvan manobir ye prayasho jita jicho. This is Taistri Lokyam. That person who is a jitya, that person who is unconquerable by the mind and senses of an ordinary living entity, he becomes conquered by that humble disposition of the devotee. And by being conquered by that humble disposition of the devotee, Premanjana Chorita Bhakti Vilochanena, Santais Premanjana Chorita Bhakti Vilochanena, Santaisateshu Hidayeshu Vilokayanti, Yam Shama Sundarama Chintya Gunaswarupam, Govindamadi Purusham, Tamaham Bhajambi. That person who has humbly submitted themselves to the feet of someone who carries Krishna within their heart, through that mood of service, that mood of devotion, that devotee, through the Ladini and Samfit Shakti coming from the merciful vibrations which emanate from his lips, his lotus-like lips, installs the Supreme Personality of Godhead within the heart of that person. And due to the eyes of love which gaze upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna reveals himself to that person and he becomes conquered by the love of that person. So Mayavadis fail to understand that even higher than being the Supreme Personality of Godhead is being the devotee of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because the devotees are able to conquer the Supreme Personality of Godhead with their love and with their devotion. And in order to maintain that relationship, in order to facilitate rasa within that relationship, the absolute truth is never homogeneous, but it's always variegated, it's always dynamic, and it's always full of ecstatic, harmonious exchanges of love and devotion taking place between the Lord and his various kinds of devotees. So this story is very instructive. Srila Prabhupada would tell it frequently in his classes, and he would specifically tell it in relationship to this Jnane Prayasyam Udapasyam Namanta Eva. So to conclude, the Mayavadis are like this frog, which is trying to make themselves equal to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But in the process of trying to equate themselves with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, they simply make a fool out of themselves and explode due to their false pride. Whereas the devotee, they keep themselves in a humble position, and due to that humble position, they are able to understand the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead by the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Nayam Prabhacha Nayam Ma Pravacha Yena Labyo Namedya Na Bahuna Shutena. Yameva Sa Vivinutena Labyas Taisyatma Atma Vivinute Tanusvam. That Krishna cannot be understood by any amount of pravachana, hearing classes. Krishna cannot be understood by any amount of material intelligence. And Krishna cannot be understood even through the process of hearing for a very long time. One can't attain the Supreme Personality of Godhead in any of those ways. But the Supreme Personality of Godhead becomes revealed to who he chooses himself to. And Krishna only becomes conquered by the love of his devotees. Sadhavo hridayam manyam, sadhavo hridayam twaham. Someone who carries Krishna within their heart and has bounded Krishna with the ropes of love within their heart, that person is able to understand Krishna due to the humility and the natural position of devotion which is flowing from the heart of that personality. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Thank you for the class. I really like the story and how you connected it with the ignorance of the Mayavadis. And I also like the purports that you read from Chaitanya Charitamrita, 18th chapter. Is this What chapter is that, Pro? Is I mean,
The Passion
teachings.
definition.
No, no. The first verse that Prabhuji began with, so it was Jiva Ishwar Tattva Prabhu Nahe Sama Jwala Dagni Rashi Chase Pulinge Rupana. This is Madhya Lila 18, chapter 113.
It's Mahaprabhu's visit to Vrindavan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because
I was wondering what is the context here. He's explaining the Pashandi and he's explaining this.
yeah, so he meant that this is after the pastime of the people thinking that they saw Krishna in the lake
Hmm.
in the Yamuna, but it was actually a fisherman.
Oh, okay.
And then afterwards, um, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, actually, Lord Krishna has returned to Vrindavan. That is the truth, and it is also true that people have seen him. But where they are seeing Krishna is their mistake. It is like considering a dry tree to be a person.
Hmm.
And then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu then asked them, where have you seen Krishna directly? And the people replied, you are a sannyasi, you renunciate, therefore you are moving Narayana. Jagama Narayana is what they referred to him as. So due to a Mayavad conception which they had, they were referring to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as Narayana. But Chaitanya Mahaprabhu teaching the world the falsity of Mayavad,
Hmm.
took the position as a humble devotee in such a circumstance and propounded the proper Siddhanta.
Yeah, thank you, bro. In the purport, it mentions that anybody who follows impersonalists like the Dattatre, he is also Pashandi.
Yeah,
So,
correct.
which the Dattatre I is his bro? Because I know the Dattatre is one of the expansions of Krishna who
Yeah,
comes.
there's a philosophy in India of this Dattatreya, and they have like this whole concocted philosophy that actually he's um, I don't know it so well, to be completely honest. I know that it has many tinges of Mayavad inside of it. And I've met such people in India. They have really, really weird ideas.
Bro, your voice is breaking. Sometimes, it, yeah, it's breaking now. It's low, very low.
Is this better?
Yeah, this is great. Yes.
So I don't know for sure what it means because I don't know so much. This is referring to some type of philosophy in India. But I have had experience as being in India, meeting people who uh who were showing me their sampradaya and all the incarnations, and
Hmm.
it's really, really like concocted philosophy. They say
Hmm.
that Sai Baba is an incarnation of Dattatreya, and they have so many, wacky ideas going on inside their head. Basically, it's just mental concoction. I
Hmm.
don't know what Jiva Goswami is referring to. Obviously, this philosophy had been existing for some time up to that point. But I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
Okay. Okay. And Prabhu, the verse that you mentioned about Yene Arvindaksh Vimuktamaninas, Tvai, Tvai,
Vayasha Bhava Abhashuddha Buddhaya.
that a person who thinks himself to become equal to Krishna, that this is because of their impure intelligence. So that translation says that even though they rise to the Parampadam, they
Yeah,
fall down again. But I don't understand if they are following a false philosophy. How can they rise to Parampadam? Parampadam, what is it referring to? How can, yeah, that's my confusion. How can, if they are not following something which is true, I mean, they are thinking oneself to be Krishna. How can they even rise? I mean, falling back is fine, but how can they even rise to Parampadam?
it's a good question. And I think Srila Prabhupada explains it in his purport to that verse. Let's look it up. What's the verse number?
It's 10 to 32.
So Srila Prabhupada, if you look at his word for word in the Bhagavatam, Param Padam, the highest position according to their imagination and speculation. So Prabhupada in his purport, he described that this Param Padam means different things for different people. I had to remind myself by looking at the word for word. But now I'm remembering what Prabhupada says in the purport. He refers to like politicians. He refers to like social, capitalist, communists, and he describes how they all have their param padam, their ultimate attainment. But because that param padam is not the lotus feet, yushma angriyaha, neglecting the lotus feet of the Lord, that param padam is not actually a stable position. It may be their ultimate attainment, but in truth, it's not the ultimate attainment. So they may have concocted this idea, as Prabhupada is saying in his word for word, the highest position, and then in parentheses, according to their imagination and speculation. So it's a concocted ultimate attainment. They may think that they've become Narayana, but actually they've become lower than the worm and stool. They're in the lowest position, but in the intoxication of their pride, they've considered themselves Narayana. I mean, it's just like if you're ever in Venice Beach and someone comes up to you and says that they're Jesus, that person's like completely illusion. In the same way, when people declare themselves to be Narayana just because they've taken sannyas, they're in complete delusion. They're completely insane. So although they may think that they've come to the Parampadam, we can see that their activities don't reflect the activities of transcendence. They open mundane hospitals, they open mundane charities and orphanages. But where does it say that Narayana is engaged in such activities in the Shastra? Narayana is sitting next to the goddess of Lakshmi, completely aloof from all material activities, and is engaging in loving exchanges with his devotees. They may have, different what's the word I'm looking for? I'm forgetting the something that Madhavananda Prabhu said about this. I'm forgetting the term that he used though. Actually, it was Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati that said it. Like the dupers and their duped followers, something like that. So they may have they're duping people, and they may have their duped followers following them around and praising them. But actually, they're just paving their way. They're just the blind leading the blind. So in the same way, politicians may have followers. In the same way, great capitalists may have followers, but their position isn't stable. They have to come down from that position. That param padam is not the ultimate attainment. It's not the factual param padam. It is a concocted param padam.
Thank you, bro. That was in my head for a long time. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, if you look at the purport, especially if you are paying attention to the word for word, a lot of these things get cleared up in Prabhupada's word for words. And if they don't get cleared up in the word for words, then they'll get cleared up. Like if you just look at the first sentence, aside from devotees, there are many others, non-devotees, known as karmis, jnanis, yogis, philanthropists, altruists, politicians, impersonalists, and voidists. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said dupes and sub-dupes.
Dupes and sub-dupes.
Hare Krishna, Devavratha, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Hey, thank you very much for leading the class with us this morning. So my question is, I've heard of this word before. It's Advaita,
Yeah, Advaita Vedanta.
Advaita Vedanta. So if I understand like the meaning of Advaita, that means non-dual, which
Correct.
means like not two, but actually like unity or oneness. And I guess what I've heard is that people that follow that philosophy, it's like the literatures that they draw their philosophies from is more from the ancient Vedas, and does not as much incorporate the Puranas, which describe the activities and pastimes of the Lord. And so it's more of philosophical, and it, it's more philosophically based, and it's but like recently in a we've been reading the Chaitanya Charitamrita once a week, um, and recently we heard about the pastime whenever Lord Chaitanya went to meet the sannyasis, um, and he went there, and he was very humble, and he took the position where the feet were being washed and these kind of things. And then what he did um, before he left was he actually manifested his effulgence, and also instructed them to kind of like take like the point at which their philosophy had reached, and then actually completed it by giving them like a more complete understanding. And so I feel like I can appreciate the idea that because it's an offensive mentality to put oneself uh, on equal footing with the Lord. At the same time, though, like one of the things that Prabhupada preaches against a lot is the value of the human life, um, to inquire into the absolute truth, that that actually like people that are under this like under that extent of realization, hey, at least on the one hand, they recognize that the importance of inquiry. At least they recognize the
They
importance of
they 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 don't though, actually,
uh,
because their inquiry is not based on the absolute truth. Their inquiry is about solidifying their position in a artificial conception of life. Mayavad philosophy in its pinnacle, in its like full-blown manifestation, is the complete articulation of the bewilderment of the living entity. And it's the complete justification of a living entity to be in the material world. So it's the exact opposite of Atato Brahma Jignasya. The whole point of um, Shankaracharya's philosophy was to bewilder those who were envious to the Supreme Personality of Godhead in Kali Yuga, in order to justify their envious disposition to want to be God, because Kali Yuga is pervaded by such a disposition. Though
yeah.
Mayavad does not exist in any other yuga except for Kali Yuga, because it's there to facilitate the envious disposition of the living entity.
Oh
So
wow, I
it's
didn't know that it didn't exist in other yugas.
yeah, it doesn't. The Puranas explain that Shiva appears in Kali Yuga in order to propound Mayavad philosophy. It's not mentioned. It's not mentioned in any other yugas, the presence of Mayavad philosophy. Mayavad philosophy exists in Kali Yuga in order to give validation and justification to those who are extremely envious of the Supreme Personality of Godhead to go on with their, illusion and sense gratification program. Mayavad is the is the last snare of Maya, which means that the subtlety of it and the intricacy of it is very, very perplexing, actually. And as I said, the devotees of Srila Prabhupada, they're wondering, why is Prabhupada speaking so much against Mayavad? And then they realize, because we're the Mayavadis. So actually, to be in the material world means that one is a Mayavad, because one has some subtle disposition within themselves, which may be conscious or may be unconscious, to want to take the position of Krishna. The whole material world is there to facilitate this Mayavad conception. So there's nothing to be appreciated in Mayavad philosophy. There's nothing. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the reason why he took that humble disposition with them, and he, exhibited his effulgence, was because Mayavadis can only become impressed by that effulgence, and they can only be impressed by learning. So Mahaprabhu took such a humble position that Prakashananda Saraswati, it kind of broke his heart to see him being in such a position, because Mayavadi philosophers, they follow very strict smarta rules and regulations. So to sit down in a place where you wash your feet in India is considered to be like an extremely deplorable position. So Prakashananda Saraswati, he reached out his hand and he said, no, please come sit with us. And when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went and sat with them, that was Prakashananda Saraswati's first bit of devotional service. So actually that pastime isn't so much showing the inquiry of the Mayavadis, because actually they were completely envious of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But what was to be appreciated is that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's humility was able to humble the Mayavadis, and that's where they became glorious. When they became humbled by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's humility, because that humility is objectively absent within someone who is infected by Mayavad philosophy. The whole conception of Mayavad itself is full-blown pride and full-blown arrogance. As Srila Prabhupada is saying in this purport in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Sorry, I have to go back on my computer. Anyways, I don't think I could. Tonta Karnava, do you have those verses still on CC? I pulled them up, but I lost them.
Yes, bro.
Oh wait, I still have. What are the verses?
18,113 onwards. Madhya 18,113.
Yeah, 18.
113.
18,113. Yeah, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says the following in this section on 115. Ye muda kahe jiva ishvara haya sam seta pashanti haya donde tariyam. That the Ishvara hoya and Jiva Ishvara hoya sam. So one who equates the living entity and Ishvara to be sama, to be the same. Seta pashanti. That person is a pasanti. He's a first-class atheist. Srila Prabhupada says is a first-class atheist. So the material world is to facilitate atheism. If someone is maintaining and trying to justify Mayavad philosophy, they're the topmost of atheists. So it goes on to say, a foolish person who says that the Supreme Personality of God is the same as the living entity is an atheist. And he becomes subject to punishment by the Supreme Superintendent of Death, Yamaraj. So if their inquiry was appreciated, it would fall into the category of Nehabi Kramanashtosti Pratatvayo Navidyate, Swalpamappa Siddharmasya, Trayate Mahatobaya. They would get some credit for that inquiry. But we can see, despite the fact that they're doing some type of so-called inquiry, which seems to be spiritual, it's actually not spiritual at all, because they're not getting any credit for the activity that they're engaging in. Actually, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he explains in his Harinam Chintamani that one who's chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra with a Pratibimba Abbas, which means there's Chaya Abbas, which is like a shadow of the name, which is just standard Nam Abbas, where one's trying to get freed from offenses. And just due to immaturity in the practice of devotion, they haven't come to the level of Shuddhanam. But by studying the Shastra, by taking in Sambandha Gyan, that Chayanamavas can rise into Suryanamavas, where a ray of the pure name is coming through, and that Suryanamavas can become full-blown Shuddhanam. But there's Pratibimbanamavas, which means a reflection of the name. A shadow and a reflection, they seem to be similar, but what's the difference between a shadow and a reflection? Is that a reflection is connected to the original object, whereas the reflection is completely disconnected from the original object. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur explains that if one has a Mayavad conception, they're better off not chanting the holy names than chanting the holy name with such a conception, because they contaminate themselves and they contaminate others. Avaishnava matho girnam uttam harikatam ritam. That one should avoid hearing the holy names from someone with such a conception, and one should avoid hearing speeches from such a conception, because that pure thing, as pure as the holy name, as pure as Krishna Katha, as pure as Atato Brahma Jignasya, as pure as inquiry to the self, it becomes contaminated by the poison of Mayavad, even a tinge of it. Mayabasha Shunyalhoy Sarvanash. That's why Mahaprabhu is so adamant about saying that Mayavad philosophy, hearing it is like poison, and can even cripple the consciousness of someone who's a Mahabhagavat, because it's very, very philosophically enticing. So it's the last snare of Maya, because it can easily take anyone off the path of devotional service. So I'm just pointing it out because there's nothing to be appreciated in Mayavad philosophy. There's nothing to be appreciated in their so-called spiritual practices. What's to be appreciated in the pastime which you're mentioning with Prakashananda Saraswati is Mahaprabhu's humility, and that humility was able to bring down the position of those who consider themselves to be Narayan, to hear from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was able to convert them.
Very interesting, Prabhu. Thank you very much. And don't you think, like, in the West, like the impersonalism in the West is kind of like on the opposite end of the spectrum, like where it's kind of like our science and like our culture and stuff like that. It's almost as if we seek to like rewrite the history of the universe to like eliminate any like admittance that it's from God. You know what I mean? Like when they talk about the Big Bang, and then people have to get a heart.
The Big Bang, according to some theistic scientists, is a great benediction for theists, because it's admitting that there's something which had to happen. Some theistic scientists, they praise the Big Bang. I'm not saying I support it, but it's a step in the direction of theism, because once you say the Big Bang, what made it bang? So yeah, there is a tendency to sidestep the Supreme Personality of Godhead in materialistic science, and that's why Srila Prabhupada is so adamant about it. But you can see, if you study Prabhupada's Pranam Mantra, Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Prachadine Nivishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadeshatarine, that eradication of Nirvishesha, Mayavad philosophy, and Shunyavadi, that is all contained within Srila Prabhupada's adamant opposition to materialistic science, because the traces of Mayavad, the manifestation of Mayavad, the root of those sciences actually come from Mayavad itself. Because as soon as you negate the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and you become the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it means you can do things the way you like. So the root of these materialistic sciences is this Mayavad conception. And it's the presence of that Mayavad philosophy in the world which has facilitated the continuation of these various types of sciences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prabhu. I think we can stop here.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Let's thank Devavratha Prabhu with 3 Hari Bols. Hari Bol! Hari Bol! Hari Bol!
Hari Bol!
Thank you all very much. Hari Bol.
culture.